USS Salt Lake City was the second of two Pensacola-class cruisers. For more detailed information on the class's design and armament, see the video on the class as a whole, a link appearing now and in the description. Originally designated as a light cruiser despite her 8-inch guns, largely on account of her relatively minimal armour, the Salt Lake City was laid down in 1927, launched at the start of 1929, and commissioned at the end of the same year. During her early service, she would operate off the Atlantic coast, picking up a redesignation as a heavy cruiser in 1931 with the new terms of the First London Naval Treaty, and was then reassigned to the Pacific Fleet in 1932, which for most of this period was based on the US West Coast. Fortunately for her, on December 7, 1941, like her sister ship, she wasn't at Pearl Harbor. In this case, she was escorting the carrier USS Enterprise, which was on its way back, but still a few hundred miles away when word of the attack reached them. As a result, the cruiser took part in the first official US Navy offensive operations, looking for stragglers from the Japanese forces before heading out to hunt submarines. Enterprise managed to get one, and Salt Lake City tried to shoot at another on the surface, but this latter attack was unsuccessful. Her subsequent actions consisted largely of carrier escort duty, first trying to support Wake Island, and then reinforcing other islands like Midway, as well as supporting air and shore bombardment strikes against the Marshall Islands. She would also be part of the task force involved in the Doolittle raid on the Japanese home islands, but as a result, she and the rest of the task force would not be able to get back in time to support USS Yorktown and USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea. More carrier escort duty would follow, including survivors of the USS Wasp when the carrier was torpedoed, until the Solomon Islands campaign kicked off in earnest. This would afford the ship the chance to fight the actual battle it had been designed for. The Japanese Navy was running supplies and men to Guadalcanal via the so-called Tokyo Express, mostly comprising of cruisers and destroyers, along with fast supply ships, most of which were actually more destroyers. And they would run in at night to deliver their cargo and then hopefully be out of air attack range by dawn. Along with USS Boise, Helena, and San Francisco, Salt Lake City was assigned to pick off the transports, which of course carried the bulk of the supplies. This rather odd force of a modern heavy cruiser, an overgunned and redesignated light cruiser, as well as two modern well-armed light cruisers, would find themselves informed in mid-October 1942 that a Japanese force was inbound. Exact accounts differ as to what happened, so I've largely chosen to go with the US Navy's official account of events, supplemented by some other reports. Scout planes were launched, and although two of the cruisers had advanced radar, Rear Admiral Scott had chosen USS San Francisco, the biggest cruiser, as his flagship, but it did not have the advanced radar. Salt Lake City's aircraft managed to catch fire and crash upon launch, but the Japanese officers who saw it thought that this was a flare from their own forces, and so began to signal at the US force using lights. The American force, of course, refused to reply, and began to adjust course to cross the enemy T, their main opposition being the three older Japanese heavy cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka. The USS Helena asked for permission to act, assuming that Admiral Scott knew what was going on, but without radar on the flagship it would appear he possibly was not fully up to speed with the situation, and so was rather surprised when his return signal of Roger resulted in the entire US battle line opening fire in short order. The Japanese were equally surprised and thought that the attackers were other Japanese ships, whilst after a short time of firing, Admiral Scott ordered a brief ceasefire since he was also worried that his forces were attacking their own ships. With that little issue cleared up for both sides, firing resumed, Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki both taking fatal damage. On the Japanese cruiser, this was in part because her torpedoes were hit and caught fire, which made her a rather obvious target in the darkness. In return, Kinosaga hit Boise when the latter turned on its searchlights, blowing up one of the main magazines and almost sinking the US cruiser. Ironically, the vast amounts of water rushing in through the resulting hole quenched most of the fires before the ship could explode entirely. Salt Lake City intervened and exchanged fire with Kinosaga, taking a number of heavy hits for her troubles, but possibly saving Boise from further damage. After 4 months of repairs, she would be back for another surface action, this time off the Komandorski Islands, where along with the Omaha-class USS Richmond, the Salt Lake City engaged 2 much more powerful modern Japanese heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers, along with supporting destroyers on both sides, in an effort to prevent Japanese resupply of nearby garrisons. Trying to sink the enemy transports, the American ships found themselves on the losing side of a gunnery duel with their escorts, with Salt Lake City rapidly taking hits, but returning accurate fire at the same time, the American radar advantage being somewhat negated by the daylight nature of this particular battle. The damage quickly mounted up, and soon Salt Lake City was dead in the water. But, as with Samar, American destroyers charged, using smoke to cover the cruiser, and their own bold close-range torpedo assaults to distract the enemy and draw their fire. This gave time to get some of the engines back up, and although the Japanese were still on the verge of victory, with the American cruisers reduced to throwing out high-explosive shells as their armor-piercing supplies had run out, the Japanese also intercepted calls for aerial support, understandably, from the US forces, and then mistook the much larger plumes of water from high-explosive shell detonations as misses from high-altitude bombing runs, concluded they were under air attack, and withdrew, having taken moderate damage in return from Salt Lake City and Richmond. The rather lucky cruiser was then back in for repairs before seeing out the war as an escort ship for carrier and landing forces, with the odd shore bombardment thrown in for good measure. With many more modern cruisers available, it's therefore not surprising that after the obligatory Magic Carpet run, Salt Lake City was decommissioned and scheduled for use in the Operation Crossroads atomic bomb tests. But neither of the blasts sank her, and she would eventually have to be sunk in a live-fire exercise off California in May 1948.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.